In the frozen hollows of Tennessee, 1881 brought winters so cruel they could bury a family in silence for months. There lived Savannah Mae Garrett, praised for her devotion, pitied for her loss. When her mother died in childbirth, the 19-year-old girl was left alone with the man who made it happen. Neighbors saw duty. They never saw the vengeance brewing behind her calm eyes. Over 4 years in a barn hidden deep within the mountains, Savannah built her own kind of justice, one that defied every law of nature and God. What they found carved into those walls still haunts Tennessee. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're brave enough for this journey. Subscribe so you don't miss stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Sheriff Coleman Pierce had investigated countless crimes during his 6 years patrolling the Tennessee mountain counties, but nothing prepared him for what he discovered on the Garrett property that cold March morning in 1881. Court records document his initial report with clinical precision. One pregnant female approximately 7 months along, 3 small children ranging from 2 to 4 years of age, and 1 adult male found chained in the barn loft, barely alive. The carved messages covering every wooden surface told a story that would haunt Pierce until his death 22 years later. The horror began 4 years earlier, in the brutal winter of 1877, when Martha Garrett died screaming in a pool of blood on the cabin floor. Dr. William Morrison's medical notes, preserved in county courthouse files, document the cause with devastating clarity. Premature labor induced by severe blunt force trauma to the abdomen, consistent with violent beating. 19-year-old Savannah Mae Garrett held her mother's hand as life drained from her body, watching helplessly as Jeremiah Garrett stood in the corner, whiskey on his breath, refusing to meet his dying wife's eyes. Neighbor Patience Dalton later testified that Savannah's screams that night could be heard 2 miles through the forest, echoing off the mountain walls like the wails of the damned. What the sparse mountain community witnessed in the months following Martha's funeral appeared to be extraordinary filial devotion. Savannah took over all household duties, tended the livestock, and seemed to care for her grieving father with saint-like patience. Reverend Samuel Crenshaw noted in his circuit diary that the young woman's dedication was a testament to Christian virtue in the face of tragedy. But traveling merchant Thomas Henley's detailed ledger books, submitted as evidence during the subsequent trial, reveal a disturbing pattern of purchases that began just weeks after the funeral. Starting in early 1878, Savannah began ordering unusual items during Henley's quarterly supply runs. Court documents show she purchased heavy chains typically used for logging operations, rope in quantities far exceeding normal farm needs, and laudanum in doses that raised the merchant's suspicions. When Henley questioned the medical supplies, Savannah claimed her father suffered from severe grief-induced insomnia, requiring strong sedatives for sleep. The merchant's testimony reveals he found her explanation plausible, noting that mountain men often turned to drink and drugs following family tragedies. By spring of 1878, neighbors began noticing that Jeremiah Garrett never appeared outside his property boundaries. Ezra Dalton's sworn statement describes his growing concern when the older man stopped participating in seasonal barn raising and harvest activities that were considered sacred obligations among mountain families. When Dalton approached the Garrett cabin to check on his neighbor's welfare, Savannah intercepted him at the property line, explaining that her father had grown reclusive since Martha's death and preferred solitude for his grief. The isolation deepened as 1878 progressed into the harsh mountain winter. Sheriff Pierce's investigative notes document that no male footprints led away from the Garrett property during the entire cold season, despite Savannah's claims that her father periodically walked the mountain trails for exercise. More disturbing, The Dalton family began hearing strange sounds emanating from the direction of the Garrett barn during night hours. Patience Dalton's testimony describes metal clanking and what sounded like a man crying that continued for hours after sunset, sounds completely inconsistent with normal livestock activity. Merchant Henley's spring 1879 visit revealed additional alarming purchases. His detailed records show Savannah ordered men's clothing in her father's size, food portions consistent with feeding, someone who never appeared in public, and herbal tinctures typically used for sedating difficult livestock. When Henley pressed for payment, Savannah produced gold coins from sources she refused to identify, claiming her father had been saving money for future investments. The merchant's growing suspicions were documented in letters to his wife, later submitted as evidence, describing his sense that something profoundly wrong was occurring on the isolated mountain property. As 1879 advanced, Reverend Crenshaw made repeated attempts to visit Jeremiah for spiritual counseling, as was customary for bereaved community members. Church records show Savannah turned him away each time, explaining that her father was too overcome with grief to receive visitors and requested prayers from a distance. The preacher's diary entries preserved in church archives reveal his increasing concern about a man who'd never missed monthly services suddenly abandoning his faith entirely. When Crenshaw suggested bringing other community members to offer support, Savannah became agitated, insisting that her father's healing required complete isolation from outside influences. By winter's end in 1880, the truth was festering like an infected wound beneath the mountain snow. What Sheriff Pierce would eventually discover in that barn loft represented evil so methodical and calculating that it challenged every assumption about human nature and family bonds. The transformation of the Garrett barn from simple livestock shelter to prison occurred during the bitter cold of February 1878, when Savannah Mae Garrett served her father his final free meal. Court documents reveal her methodical planning through diary entries discovered beneath loose floorboards, written in her careful schoolgirl script. "Tonight I begin Mama's justice. He will learn what it means to plant death in a woman's belly." Dr. Morrison's later examination of Jeremiah's system confirmed the presence of laudanum residue consistent with a massive sedative dose, enough to render a grown man unconscious for 12 hours, while his own daughter chained him like livestock in the loft above. Sheriff Pierce's crime scene documentation provides chilling details of the restraint system Savannah constructed during those winter months. Heavy logging, chains purchased through Merchant Henley's supply runs were bolted directly into the barn support beams, using hardware that required considerable strength and planning to install. The positioning was calculated with disturbing precision, close enough to the hay bales for basic shelter, far enough from the barn doors to prevent any escape attempts, and positioned to allow complete control over the captive's most basic needs. Pierce's notes describe finding a wooden bucket permanently chained within reach that served as both water vessel and waste container for 4 years of imprisonment. The first carved message appeared within days of Jeremiah's captivity, scratched into the barnwood with desperate fingernails when Savannah refused to provide eating utensils. Court evidence shows the earliest marking simply read Y, followed by deep gouges that suggested frantic clawing at the wooden walls. These primitive scratches would evolve over the following months into increasingly elaborate pleas for mercy, death, and forgiveness. Carved with makeshift tools, fashioned from hay and splinters, the progression of messages documented by Pierce's careful transcription reveals a man's sanity slowly disintegrating under the weight of unthinkable captivity. Savannah's twisted justification for her actions emerged through testimony she provided with chilling matter-of-fact delivery during her eventual trial. Court stenographer records show her explaining the moral framework that governed her revenge. Mama died birthing his evil seed after he beat her like a dog, so now he'll plant righteous seeds in me until I birth enough souls to balance God's scales. This calculated breeding plan began in spring 1878, when Savannah, now 20 years old, made her first nocturnal visit to the barn loft, carrying the key to her father's chains and a perverted sense of biblical justice. Neighbor observations during this period, documented in sworn affidavits, reveal how Savannah maintained her facade of grieving daughter while orchestrating systematic torture. Patience Dalton testified that Savannah appeared at community gatherings looking increasingly gaunt and hollow-eyed, explaining her deteriorating appearance as grief over her father's continued absence. The younger woman claimed Jeremiah had found work in distant coal mines, sending money home but unable to visit, due to dangerous mining conditions. Dalton's statement reveals she offered to help with farm work, noting that maintaining the property alone seemed beyond one person's capabilities, but Savannah refused all assistance with suspicious vehemence. Merchant Henley's quarterly visits during 1878 and 79 provided crucial evidence of Savannah's careful preparation for her horrific plan. His detailed ledgers show purchases of medical supplies typically associated with childbirth, clean linens, herbal medicines for pain relief, and nutritional supplements for pregnant women. When Henley commented on these unusual orders for a household containing no expectant mothers, Savannah explained she was studying midwifery skills to serve the isolated mountain community. The merchant's testimony reveals he found this explanation admirable, praising her dedication to helping neighbors despite her own family tragedy. The first of Savannah's revenge pregnancies became evident by late 1878, approximately 9 months after her father's imprisonment began. Dr. Morrison's medical records preserved in county files document his attendance at the birth of a healthy male child in March 1879. The physician noted in his report that no father was present during the delivery, which he attributed to Jeremiah's continued absence for mining work. Morrison's testimony reveals that Savannah handled the birth with unusual composure for a first-time mother, almost as if she had been preparing for this moment with military precision. Community members who attended the baby's baptism ceremony, documented in church records, maintained by Reverend Crenshaw, observed Savannah's strange behavior toward her newborn son. Witness statements describe her referring to the infant as Mama's justice baby and making cryptic comments about the child's purpose in God's plan. When congregation members offered congratulations on her beautiful son, Savannah would respond with disturbing phrases like, "He's the first payment towards settling the debt," that left other mountain families deeply uncomfortable about her mental state. By winter 1879, the carved messages in the barn loft had evolved from simple pleas into communications documenting Jeremiah's psychological deterioration. Pierce's transcription reveals increasingly frantic scratches. "1 year in hell, please kill me," followed by detailed tallies marking each day of captivity carved in neat rows across the wooden beams. The most disturbing messages described his dawning realization of Savannah's breeding plan, with scratches that read, "She is with child, my child. God, forgive me," gouged so deeply into the wood that they remained visible decades later. The methodical evil that Savannah had unleashed was only beginning to reveal its true scope as 1880 approached. Sheriff Pierce's investigation during the spring of 1880 revealed the horrifying scope of Savannah's systematic revenge through evidence that challenged every assumption about maternal instinct and family bonds. Court records document his discovery of detailed diary entries hidden beneath the cabin floorboards, written in Savannah's meticulous handwriting and describing her breeding plan with clinical precision. Second justice baby due harvest time. Third will come next spring. Need 7 more to balance what he did to Mama. The mathematical calculation of human suffering, documented in her own words, demonstrated a level of premeditation that shocked even experienced lawmen familiar with frontier brutality. Dr. Morrison's medical examination of Savannah's second pregnancy in 1879 provided crucial evidence of the systematic nature of her crimes. His patient notes preserved in county medical files document unusual physical indicators consistent with forced conception rather than natural pregnancy timing. The physician testified that Savannah displayed none of the emotional responses typical of expectant mothers, instead treating her condition as a business transaction requiring careful management. When Morrison inquired about the absent father's involvement in prenatal care, Savannah responded with chilling matter-of-factness. "He's providing exactly what's needed for this baby, nothing more." The second child, born in October 1879, exhibited disturbing signs that alarmed Dr. Morrison enough to document his concerns in official medical records. Court evidence shows the infant displayed unusual behavioral patterns during early development, including an apparent aversion to male voices and extreme agitation when men approached. Morrison's testimony revealed that Savannah encouraged these reactions, praising the baby when he cried in the presence of male visitors and referring to his fear as righteous recognition of evil. The physician's growing suspicions were documented in letters to medical colleagues describing behavioral patterns he'd never witnessed in normal family situations. Neighbor Patience Dalton's sworn testimony provides disturbing evidence of how Savannah was conditioning her children to serve her twisted vision of justice. Court records show Dalton witnessed Savannah teaching her toddler son to refer to carved wooden figures as the evil man who killed grandmama, encouraging the child to strike the figures while reciting phrases about punishment and revenge. When Dalton expressed concern about exposing such young children to violent concepts, Savannah responded that her sons needed to understand their sacred purpose in balancing God's scales. Dalton's statement reveals her growing horror at realizing these weren't normal grief responses, but systematic indoctrination of innocent children. The carved messages in the barn loft during this period, documented through Sheriff Pierce's careful transcription, revealed Jeremiah's complete psychological breakdown as he grasped the full extent of his daughter's plan. Court evidence shows increasingly desperate scratches. 2 years, 2 babies, please end this nightmare, followed by detailed calculations matching Savannah's own diary entries about her intended timeline. The most chilling message, carved in shaking letters across an entire wooden beam, read, "She brings them to see me, calls me evil. Grandpa makes them spit on me. God, what have I become?" Pierce's notes describe finding these words gouged so deeply into the wood that they appear to have been carved during episodes of complete mental collapse. Merchant Henley's testimony revealed how Savannah's purchases evolved to accommodate her growing family of revenge children while maintaining her father's captivity. His detailed ledgers show orders for infant supplies in quantities suggesting multiple small children, combined with continued purchases of chains, locks, and sedatives that painted a picture of ongoing imprisonment. When Henley commented on the apparent contradiction between caring for babies and needing livestock restraints, Savannah explained she was helping other isolated families with both childcare and farm animal control. The merchant's statement reveals his growing unease with explanations that seemed carefully rehearsed rather than naturally offered. Reverend Crenshaw's church records from 1880 document the baptism of Savannah's second child, with notes that reveal his mounting concern about the young woman's spiritual condition. Court evidence shows the preacher's diary entries describing Savannah's behavior during religious ceremonies as unnaturally calm for a woman bearing children without husband or family support. When Crenshaw offered prayers for the absent father's safe return from mining work, Savannah responded with biblical quotations about eye-for-eye justice that seemed inappropriate for baptismal celebrations. The Reverend's testimony reveals his attempts to counsel her about forgiveness and Christian charity were met with cold stares and references to divine retribution that chilled his blood. The third pregnancy, confirmed by Dr. Morrison in spring 1880, coincided with increasingly desperate carved messages from the barn loft that suggested Jeremiah's complete mental disintegration. Sheriff Pierce's transcription reveals scratches that had devolved into barely legible pleas. 3 years, 3 babies, kill me, please can't take more, followed by what appeared to be attempted suicide tallies marked in groups of 5 across multiple wooden beams. The physical evidence showed Jeremiah had tried to harm himself using fragments of broken chains, but Savannah's careful monitoring prevented any successful attempts to escape through death. Community observations during 1880, documented in various witness statements, reveal how Savannah's facade was beginning to crack under the psychological strain of maintaining her elaborate deception. Multiple neighbors testified to seeing her talking to herself during rare public appearances, muttering about numbers, justice, and biblical punishment that seemed disconnected from normal conversation. The isolated mountain families, already suspicious of outsider interference, began avoiding the Garrett property entirely as rumors spread about the young woman's deteriorating mental condition and her strange obsession with divine retribution. As 1881 approached, the true horror of Savannah's 4-year campaign of revenge was reaching its calculated climax. The winter of 1880 brought Jeremiah Garrett to the absolute depths of human despair, documented through carved messages that revealed a mind completely shattered by 4 years of systematic torture. Sheriff Pierce's transcription of the barn wall carvings shows the progression from coherent pleas to fragmented scratches that barely resembled human language. 4 years, 4 years, 4 years repeated in endless rows across every reachable wooden surface, followed by desperate tallies marking each day of captivity that covered entire sections of the loft walls. The physical evidence revealed a man who had carved until his fingernails were permanently damaged using splinters, metal fragments, and eventually his own blood to document his psychological disintegration. Court records preserve the most disturbing messages from this period, carved with increasing desperation as Jeremiah realized the true scope of his daughter's breeding plan. Pierce's careful documentation shows scratches that read, "She says 7 more babies than fire," followed by frantic calculations attempting to determine how many years of torture remained before Savannah would grant him death. The sheriff's notes describe finding areas where Jeremiah had carved the same word, please, hundreds of times in cramped letters, creating a tapestry of desperation that covered nearly every inch of accessible barnwood. Medical examination later confirmed that many of these messages were carved during episodes of complete mental breakdown, evidenced by the erratic pressure and overlapping letters that suggested psychotic episodes. Savannah's own diary entries from this period, discovered during Pierce's investigation and submitted as court evidence, reveal her growing excitement as her plan approached its ultimate conclusion. Her handwriting, previously neat and controlled, became increasingly erratic as she documented her father's deteriorating condition with clinical detachment. Subject shows excellent progress toward complete mental collapse. Physical deterioration ahead of schedule, breeding program producing desired offspring with appropriate hatred levels. The calculated language she used to describe systematic torture demonstrated a level of psychological detachment that horrified even experienced court officials familiar with frontier violence. The third child, born in February 1881, exhibited the most disturbing behavioral patterns yet observed by Dr. Morrison. Medical records document the infant's extreme aversion to adult male presence, violent physical reactions to deep voices, and unusual aggression for such a young child. Morrison's testimony reveals that during routine examinations, the baby would scream with such intensity that neighbors reported hearing the sounds from significant distances. When the physician expressed concern about these abnormal responses, Savannah proudly explained that her children were born understanding their sacred mission to hate evil men who hurt women. Morrison's notes describe his growing horror at witnessing systematic conditioning of innocent infants to serve their mother's twisted vision of justice. Sheriff Pierce's investigation during early 1881 revealed physical evidence that Savannah was preparing for the final phase of her revenge plan. Court. Documents show his discovery of accelerant materials hidden in various locations around the barn, including coal oil, dry kindling, and sulfur matches stored in quantities far exceeding normal farm needs. Pierce's notes describe finding detailed sketches in Savannah's diary showing optimal placement of flammable materials to ensure complete destruction of the barn structure while preventing escape. The methodical planning for murder by fire, documented in her own handwriting, provided prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of premeditated intent to commit the ultimate act of revenge. Neighbor Ezra Dalton's testimony provided crucial evidence about the escalating danger during winter 1881. Court records show his statement describing increasingly violent sounds emanating from the Garrett property, including what he identified as screaming that continued for hours during nighttime visits to the barn. Dalton's tracking skills, honed by decades of mountain hunting, enabled him to identify multiple sets of small footprints leading to and from the barn, suggesting Savannah was bringing her children to witness their grandfather's torment. His sworn affidavit reveals that he began sleeping with loaded weapons, fearing that whatever evil had consumed the Garrett family might eventually threaten his own household. The carved messages from late winter 1881, documented through Sheriff Pierce's painstaking transcription work, revealed Jeremiah's final desperate attempts to communicate with the outside world. Court evidence shows increasingly frantic scratches. "Help me someone, please. I am Jeremiah Garrett, chained in barn daughter insane, 4 years prisoner," carved in letters so small they required magnification to read completely. Pierce's notes describe finding areas where Jeremiah had attempted to carve messages near cracks in the barn walls, apparently hoping that sound or visible scratches might alert passing travelers to his plight. The physical evidence showed he had worked until his fingers were raw and bleeding, using every available tool to create communications that no one would discover until after his rescue. Dr. Morrison's medical examination of Jeremiah during this period, conducted secretly when Savannah briefly left the property, provided shocking documentation of systematic physical deterioration. Court records preserve the physician's clinical notes describing malnutrition so severe that the patient's body weight had dropped by approximately 60 lbs over 4 years of captivity. Morrison testified that Jeremiah's muscle mass had deteriorated to the point where he could barely support his own body weight. His teeth were loose from nutritional deficiency, and his mental responses suggested advanced psychological trauma. The doctor's statement reveals that Jeremiah begged him not to reveal the examination, terrified that Savannah would discover his attempt to seek help and escalate her torture as punishment. As spring 1881 approached, Savannah's fourth pregnancy was becoming impossible to hide from the mountain community, and her carefully maintained facade was finally beginning to crumble under the weight of 4 years of systematic evil. Sheriff Coleman Pierce's discovery of the Garrett property horror on March 15, 1881, began when traveling preacher Samuel Crenshaw arrived at the county courthouse with desperate concerns about Savannah's deteriorating condition during her advanced pregnancy. Court records document Crenshaw's statement that Savannah had appeared at Sunday services, looking gaunt and wild-eyed, muttering biblical passages about divine retribution, while her 3 small children cowered behind her skirts in obvious terror. When congregation members offered assistance with a difficult pregnancy, Savannah responded with rambling threats about burning sacrifices and final justice that convinced the preacher immediate intervention was necessary to protect both mother and children. Pierce's approach to the isolated mountain property revealed immediate evidence that something catastrophic was occurring within the Garrett household. His official report documents finding the cabin in complete disarray with furniture overturned, broken dishes scattered across the floor, and what appeared to be recent blood stains on the wooden walls. The sheriff's notes described discovering Savannah in the main room, 7 months pregnant, and in obvious physical distress, surrounded by 3 terrified children who shrank away from any adult contact. When Pierce attempted to question her about the property's condition and her father's whereabouts, Savannah responded with incoherent biblical quotations and repeated references to completing God's mathematical equation of justice. The discovery in the barn loft on that March morning provided evidence of evil so systematic and calculated that it challenged every assumption about human nature and family bonds. Sheriff Pierce's detailed crime scene documentation describes finding Jeremiah Garrett chained to the barn support beams, weighing approximately 90 lbs after 4 years of systematic starvation, his body covered with infected wounds and evidence of prolonged physical abuse. Court records preserve Pierce's initial observation notes. Subject barely conscious, appears to have been restrained for extended period. Extensive carved messages covering all wooden surfaces suggest prolonged psychological torture. The physical evidence revealed a man who had been reduced to barely human condition through years of methodical torment designed to maximize suffering while preventing death. Dr. Morrison's emergency medical examination of Jeremiah, conducted immediately upon Pierce's discovery, provided clinical documentation of torture so severe it defied medical precedent. Court evidence shows Morrison's report describing malnutrition consistent with deliberate starvation, infected restraint wounds suggesting years of continuous chaining, and psychological symptoms indicating complete mental breakdown from prolonged captivity. The physician's testimony revealed that Jeremiah's first coherent words upon rescue were desperate pleas for death, begging Morrison to end his suffering rather than attempt medical treatment. Morrison's notes document finding evidence that Savannah had been bringing her children to witness their grandfather's condition, forcing them to participate in systematic psychological torture designed to generate hatred for their own biological father. Savannah's arrest and subsequent confession provided prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of premeditated murder conspiracy and systematic torture spanning 4 years. Court stenographer records preserve her complete statement, delivered with chilling composure, despite her advanced pregnancy. "I gave him exactly what he gave Mama, death by inches through the belly, 3 babies born, 7 more planned, then fire to send him to hell where he belongs." Her detailed explanation of the breeding plan, documented in official transcripts, revealed mathematical precision in calculating human suffering designed to balance what she perceived as cosmic injustice. When asked about her children's welfare, Savannah expressed pride in teaching them to recognize evil and participate in righteous punishment. The trial proceedings in May 1881 drew crowds from across Tennessee as evidence of Savannah's calculated evil was presented to a jury of 12 mountain men familiar with frontier violence but unprepared for systematic family torture. Court records document testimony from Dr. Morrison, Sheriff Pierce, and multiple neighbors that painted a picture of premeditated revenge executed with military precision over 4 years. The physical evidence presented included carved messages transcribed by Pierce, Savannah's detailed diary entries outlining her breeding plan, and medical documentation of torture so severe it challenged contemporary understanding of human cruelty. Prosecutor James Whitmore's closing argument, preserved in court transcripts, emphasized that Savannah's actions represented evil so calculated it demanded the ultimate legal response. Justice was delivered on June 23, 1881, when the jury returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on charges of kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder. Judge Samuel Harrison's sentencing statement, documented in official court records, condemned Savannah's actions as crimes against nature itself that demand the severest punishment available under Tennessee law. She received life imprisonment in the Tennessee State Penitentiary for Women, where she died during childbirth complications in March 1882, exactly 5 years after her mother's death and 1 year after her arrest. Jeremiah Garrett survived his rescue by only 3 months, dying in Dr. Morrison's care from complications related to 4 years of systematic abuse and malnutrition. His final words, documented in Morrison's notes, were expressions of gratitude for Pierce's intervention and pleas for forgiveness from a God he believed had abandoned him to unthinkable torment. The 3 children were placed with distant relatives in Kentucky. Their names changed to protect them from the horrific legacy of their birth circumstances. The Garrett barn still stands today. Its carved messages preserved as evidence of evil exposed, and justice served through the persistence of law enforcement officers who refused to ignore community silence about family violence.